Hi guys, and welcome back to the next video on my channel. Now today's video is going to be the mysterious murder of university student Chris Jenkins. I didn't realise just how much of a rabbit hole I was going to fall down researching this case. I'd heard of it before, I knew the basics of the case, I didn't realise how complex it was and just how heartbreaking it was. Obviously all these cases are heartbreaking, but reading this one really upset me. It's really sad, and you'll see why as we go along. Just a pre-warning, if you're going to search Chris's name after looking or listening at this video, then pictures of his body will be on Google Images. I learnt that the hard way, and some of them are unblurred. I've compiled together the most accurate information I could find using books and information from Chris's family, particularly his mother Jen. Without further ado, let's get into the video. It was Halloween night of 2002, and Chris, his girlfriend and his friends were on a night out to celebrate. Chris, dressed in his Native American costume, danced and appeared to have a good time. At around 12:30, Chris would be kicked out of the club as it appeared he had wet himself. However, it would later be revealed that someone had spilt a drink down him. This was the last time that Chris was ever seen alive. This is the mysterious murder of Chris Jenkins. At the time of his disappearance, Chris was a 21-year-old student excelling in his studies. He was an undergraduate at the Carlson School of Management and was set to finish his programme early, which gives you an inkling of just how motivated he was. He had a bright future ahead of him, and this was cruelly taken away. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed man was a natural at football. He loved it. He played on several high school championship teams and was also named an academic All-American. He was also co-captain for his university's lacrosse team, another sport he was very passionate about. On the day of his disappearance, Chris gave his girlfriend Amber a lift to work, and she coincidentally worked at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, which is where Chris and his friends would go to celebrate Halloween later that night. He also went to pick up his costume, he helped a friend with an ankle injury, and attended a class. The designated driver Cassidy drove Chris, his girlfriend and their friends to the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, where they had a few drinks. On the night of his disappearance, Amber looked after Chris's belongings, including his keys, wallet and phone, as his costume had no pockets. When he was kicked out of the club, he had none of these belongings with him still. According to the bar manager, around midnight, an off-duty officer called Casey approached Chris and asked if he was okay because of the wet patch on the front of Chris's costume. Chris explained to the off-duty police officer that someone had accidentally knocked a drink over him. The bar manager then added that the police officer went over to the bar security supervisor and told him to keep an eye on Chris. At around 12:30, Chris was thrown out of the club. He had no belongings, no keys, no phone, no wallet, and more importantly, no jacket. On that particular night, it was extremely cold. It was 20 degrees Fahrenheit or -6 degrees Celsius. Chris's mum, Jen, has later gone on to say that this off-duty police officer, Casey, was flirting with Amber all night, and it was rumoured that he had got Chris kicked out of the club so that he could crack on with Amber. Now, Amber stayed at the club and apparently took a lift home from Casey. She stayed for a staff meeting which she wasn't scheduled to be at, but she stayed anyway, and only realised that Chris was missing the next day when she went to drop his belongings off and he wasn't at his apartment. Police refused to investigate their colleague, stating that he had a family and kids and they didn't want to tear a family apart, which I think It's quite ironic considering that the death of Chris quite literally tore a family apart. Chris didn't return home that his family became worried and they reported him missing to the police, who weren't very helpful. They believed that Chris had simply run away, or one police officer even quoted as saying that he had gone off to sow his oats. 4 months after his disappearance, Chris's body was found floating down the Mississippi River on the 27th of February 2003. It was recovered by the Hennepin County Sheriff's Water Patrol, and even though there was no ice in the river at the time of his disappearance, he was found with a small amount of snow and ice on him. Jen Jenkins, who has relentlessly campaigned for victory for her son, has later gone on to say that the police believe that Chris had jumped off the bridge after he and Amber had an argument in the club. 6 days after Chris's disappearance, with little to no help from the police, the family took matters into their own hands. They sought for and paid for bloodhounds and their owners to commit their own canine searches. Some of the most commended bloodhound and owners were drafted in to help, who had helped with notorious murder cases in the past. On November 7th, 2002, Annie Sherman and her bloodhound started their search at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill. The dog then followed Chris's scent to a car park across the street, particularly focusing on parking stalls 89 and 90, where the dog highlighted that something significant had happened to Chris in these parking lots. The dog then led them to the middle of the highway in Hepburn Street, indicating that Chris may have been taken away in a vehicle, particularly on this lane. A second round of canine searches were completed 4 weeks later on December 7th, 2002. Tests and validities were done to secure that this dog could definitely pick up Chris's scent, and so they gave the dog the scent from his clothes and from his lacrosse helmet. The dog then picked up this scent and followed it to Chris's apartment, and particularly to Chris's room. His father later confirmed that this was his son's bedroom. There were 2 hits of particular interest during this second round of canine searches. I'm just going to look at my notes for a little bit because this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So basically the 2 hits, the first one was at the Metro Transit Commission bus and public parking facility at the intersection of 1st Avenue North and 8th Street North, It also picked up the same trail as the first canine search. However, during this search, the dog pointed out a small residue of blood in the parking stalls and also feather fragments and a red string that looked very similar to those that were on Chris's costume. Police dismissed this as the fact that these pieces of articles couldn't possibly have come from Chris. There were rumours that a police officer had actually gone to speak to the manufacturer or the maker of this costume to see if they could match the materials used to the ones found, to see if they were the same as the ones used in Chris's costume. However, nothing has ever come of this since, and there has been no mention of these particular items of evidence since. Desperate for answers, the family hired a private investigator and also sought the advice of psychics to try and find any trace of their missing son. The bloodhound also went directly below the bridge where police believed that Chris jumped off on the night of his disappearance. It was never found out who owned these parking stalls. Finding out this could have found out some kind of people who wanted to harm Chris, who had harmed Chris, but this was never found out. When his body was eventually found, it was ruled as unknown. His death was ruled as unknown, either a suicide or a potential fall due to intoxication. When police did try to find CCTV, and they did find any, there was no trace of Chris, or the places that they contacted simply had no CCTV. Their CCTV wasn't recording, it was broken at the time, they had no tape or no memory left, or tapes had simply been taped over. As we know, with CCTV, tape recordings only last a certain amount of time, which is why it's so quick in missing person cases to access CCTV ASAP. Chris's mum, Jen Jenkins, has written a book called The Footprints of Courage, which highlights Chris's story and also talks about how important it is to take every missing persons cases seriously. She also highlights some of the mistakes that the police made. She said she didn't write this book to shame the police, but to raise awareness. When his body was found, no interviews were conducted of potential witnesses, and his body was not treated as a crime scene. If it had been treated as a crime scene, maybe some potential DNA evidence could have been lifted. In 2006, his death was reclassified as a homicide when newly appointed Minneapolis Police Chief Tim Dolan came in. He held a public press conference where he apologised to the family and admitted that mistakes had been made. Jen Jenkins appreciated this, that he was, as she said, man enough to admit that the police had made a mistake. Now we're going to look at some more of the autopsy side of things and the post-mortem type of evidence now. I got a lot of these facts from a book called Case Studies in Drowning Forensics, which was written by 2 detectives, and there's a whole section on Chris's case. I'll link the book pages in the description down below because you can just read most of them. It really is interesting. However, it's very, very sciencey and very, very wordy, so I've tried to get the main points in here and simplify it as best I can. Firstly, the things that flagged up to these 2 detectives were these body positioning of Chris. Usually, drowning victims would be found face down, face in the water, unless in some special circumstances, such as if the body is heavy, so if an obese person is thrown into the water. However, Chris was a fit young lad who was found on his back, which suggests that his body was placed into the water post-mortem. Another bizarre fact was that Chris's hands were posed in a clench and his arms were posed like this, which again suggests that he was killed, posed, and then put into the water. These detectives pointed out that if Chris had entered the water when the police originally thought, then rigor mortis would have set in. However, this wasn't the case, and Chris's body was not as decomposed as you would have expected it to be if he had been in the water for as long as 4 months. They also theorised because of the weather, the temperature and the state of decomposition that the body will have entered the water between January 31st and February 21st, between the 1st and 2nd thaw. They also noted that Chris's head was tilted to the right, which is significant in killings and murders on land. Usually if somebody is killed, their head will tilt to one side or the other. However, if Chris had drowned, as police stated, his head would not have been tilted. On the night of his disappearance, Chris was also wearing oversized slip-on shoes, which were found on his body when he was recovered from the river. If he had jumped, as police had stated, the detectives theorised that his shoes would have flung off, or if he had simply fallen due to intoxication, his frantic swimming and panicking would have also forced the shoes to come off. However, his shoes were still on. Witnesses also mentioned that Chris was clean shaven on the night of the Halloween night out. However, during an autopsy, the coroner noted that there were signs of early growth facial hair. It was speculated that maybe due to the drying of his skin that it looked like early growth facial hair. However, there was no evidence or scientific evidence to back this up. Later on, an expert did zoom in onto a picture of Chris and concluded that he was clean shaven on the night of his disappearance, which would suggest that he had been kept alive for some time, enough to grow some stubble before he was killed. The autopsy also found that he was covered in mud, and we're not talking a small amount of mud, like a film of mud. He was covered in mud. There were several factors that could have caused this. His body could have been dragged through the mud, there could have been a scuffle in the mud. But you think that if his body had been in the water for as long, that this mud would have washed off. Another significant factor that I think is important to notice is that his blood alcohol level was 0.12 or 120 milligrams over 100 millilitres of blood. The legal drink drive limit in the UK is 107 milligrams to 100 millilitres of blood, which is around 1 to 2 pints of beer, depending on your size, age, height, and all those kinds of factors. I do know that once you take your last sip of alcohol, or finish your last drink, that it takes around an hour per unit to leave your system. So I'd be very interested to know how intoxicated Chris was on the night of his disappearance. If he was as intoxicated as some witnesses were making out, surely this would suggest that maybe he had been kept alive for at least a few hours, or if not a day, just to lower his blood alcohol level. He clearly wasn't intoxicated enough to have slipped and fallen into the river. Although this is a possibility that maybe he did trip, it wouldn't have been because of his intoxication levels. A sample of his liver was also sent off, and traces of GHB were found, which is a date rape drug. During the autopsy, it was also found that Chris had several insects buried under his skin. Now, these particular types of insects couldn't have survived in the freezing cold temperatures of the water. They also couldn't survive outside, which suggests that Chris's body was being stored until it was placed in the water not long before it was found. A prisoner would go on to confess that he had seen a fellow prisoner throw Chris into the water while he was still alive. However, there's been no evidence of this, and also if Chris had been thrown into the water while he was alive, the gap from the bridge to the water is very big. He would have had broken bones and injuries and bruises, but he didn't. Chris's family also noted that whenever he played a lacrosse game, he would always have bruises on his legs. However, when he was found, there was no bruises. Chris had last played a lacrosse game 2 days prior to his disappearance, so if he did have bruises, it would have taken around 2 weeks, usually, for the bruise to completely clear, depending on the severity of the bruise. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer. So if there were bruises on his legs, it would suggest that he'd been kept alive for at least enough time for these bruises to clear. However, there's no concrete evidence as far as I can find, or as far as I'm aware, that he did have bruises on his legs, so again, this is just circumstantial evidence. The most bizarre piece of evidence, arguably, is the long blonde hair that was found clenched in Chris's fist that appeared to have been placed there after his death post-mortem. It was originally believed to be one of Chris's hairs, however, on further inspection, it didn't match. A DNA comparison test was done, however, this was messed up, so the test came back inconclusive. Chris's mother, Jen, believes that her son's death or murder was to do with a satanic ritual. It's also speculated that maybe this was an initiation for a gang who had to kill somebody, or it was linked to other disappearances of young men in the area. The popular theory in this case is that Chris was killed by the Smiley-Faced Killer. Although police don't believe this theory, they don't believe that Chris's murder was linked to any other murders or abductions in the USA. For those that don't know, the Smiley-Faced Killer is a theory brought together by 2 detectives and a doctor from the St. Cloud University. They took several case studies of young men who had been abducted, murdered, and had their bodies placed in water. In at least a dozen of these cases, a smiley face was found graffitied next to the body. However, as we know in Chris's case, no smiley face was found, although it is largely believed that some kind of gang or organised crime took place and in which Chris was murdered. In 2007, charges were dropped against a potential suspect as it was believed there was not enough evidence to prosecute this potential suspect, although it was made clear that he still remained a suspect. To this day, there has been no further information and no further arrests of any other suspects in this case. Finally, I'm going to link a really interesting blog that I found online. I'm not going to talk about it in depth because I'm not sure that it's true, and I wanted to focus mainly on the facts and what had happened in the circumstances surrounding Chris's death. So this person has highlighted several young similar looking men who have gone missing from universities across the USA in very similar circumstances. I will link that in the description below along with all my other sources so you can go and do further research, which I really encourage that you do. There are lots of other theories on this case that I'm not going to include, including the fact that they believe the police officer was involved. I don't think this is true. I don't know why the police officer would risk his career for this or life in prison for just a one-night stand. But let me know what you think. Do you think that the police had something to do with this? That it was a cult that did this? I really don't have a clue, and I hope that there are some answers soon for the family. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this informative, and I'll see you in the next video.